One of my favorite things is when listeners of this show connect with me on a practice level. Sometimes that's at an in-person gig, but more often these days, that's via my live stream subscription. I don't know if you know this, but I teach 4 classes a week and I live stream them, and you can participate in them from anywhere in the world. Now, I've been doing that for a number of years, and up until now, it's always been a one-way street here where you can see me, but I can't see you. Well, that is going to change, and in the coming months this summer, we're going to beta test some new features to the live stream. We're going to learn from my weekly teachers class, which I started not so long ago, which is a totally interactive weekly meeting. Well, we're going to learn from that, and we're going to bring some of that interactivity to the live stream subscription, and I'm excited about it. It's an interesting time. All the people who are subscribed now are going to get to beta test it with me. It's going to be super fun. So just in general, if you're interested in having some practice with me, I think this would be a really cool way to do it, even if we don't live near each other. It's the J Brown Yoga live stream subscription. You can find it at jbrownyoga.com. All right. How about that? Here we are again. Unless you're new, in which case, welcome. All the rest of y'all, what's up? This is J Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. How is your day going? I hope the traffic gods are smiling on you, or you're having a good breakfast. Whatever it is that you're doing right now, maybe we could just take this moment to acknowledge our current mundane situation as sacred. Wow, that was a pretty intense way to start. I don't usually do that. I mean, I usually make a comment like that in the outro at the end before I'm saying goodbye, not right here at the beginning. Where did that come from? Oh, gosh, I know where that came from. Oh, man. Well, all right. I guess I'll just tell you this. This is so funny. This is so funny. I can't. All right, so today's talk is with Jim Mallinson. And as you will hear at the beginning of this conversation, Jim makes this comment towards the beginning about wondering what I might be entertaining my listeners with in the intro prior to the conversation that we're recording. So now that I'm sitting here to record the intro for the conversation that we recorded, I think that I was feeling just a little bit insecure, and I'm like overcompensating because I know Jim's going to listen to this, and I want him to like it. I want it to be a good intro, as good as other ones he may have heard, or I don't know what I thought. It's so funny. We're so ridiculous. Human beings, we're silly, silly, silly creatures. We really are. And I really don't think I have anything to worry about at all. As you will hear, Jim is a really easy guy to relate to. You know, you look at somebody's bio, and he's like a super bionic scholar, and for some reason I had this idea in my mind that would be difficult to relate to, that like maybe I'm just not smart enough to hold my own in a conversation with somebody with that kind of academic, chops. And that's actually how this conversation came about. I said that very thing to Seth Powell on the show some while back. I mentioned that I sometimes feel intimidated to try to have conversations with people who do that kind of rigorous scholarship. And the cool thing is, Jim listens to the show, and he heard me say that, and he wrote me this really cool email. It was very warm. It was just like a couple of sentences, but it immediately put me at ease. And I went into the conversation not at all feeling intimidated, and it went really well, and I'm super psyched. And it's just great to get to meet somebody on that level, as just a person, not whatever the letters are behind our names or whatever, just another person who has passion and interest in yoga and to share in dialogue. It's awesome. So we did run into just a bit of internet connectivity issues. So there's a couple of sections where the audio got a little rough, but you can still hear everything. And it's such a fantastic conversation. I'm really excited for you guys to hear it today. Let me mention first that I have a new blog post out this week, and I'm not really going to talk about it today, but I am going to talk about it next week and probably the week after that, because it relates to some coming episodes. I'm going to say more about this on the other side of today's conversation, but I wanted to mention it here in the intro. My new blog post, it's called Dark Nights, Soul's Direction. I thought that if you were a regular listener, as like a bit of a homework assignment, you might read that blog post in preparation for next week. Now, I also want to say that if, while you're listening to today's talk, you find yourself interested in studying the history and philosophies of yoga and Sanskrit and looking at these texts in this expansive way, I want to recommend that you go to today's sponsor, yogicstudies.com. I mentioned Seth Powell and how when I talked with him, Jim was listening, and that's how this whole conversation today came about. Well, Seth is the founder of yogicstudies.com, and I know he's greatly inspired by Jim's work, and he's doing fantastic work. I took Seth's course on the history and philosophies of yoga. I had a fantastic experience, and I learned so much from him. He's really gifted at presenting this stuff in a way that makes it quite accessible, and I think helps really expand somebody's knowledge base and become smarter practitioners. So as a listener of the show, you can get 15% off if you use promo code JBrown15, all capital letters. You got to make it all capital letters. It's promo code JBrown15, all capital letters. You get 15% off any of the courses. Go to yogicstudies.com. Also, let me quickly just drop my stuff. I'm going to be in Australia, May 25th through June 2nd. Just a couple of spots left at Sydney. I think it's like 1 or 2 spots left if you want to get in on Sydney. There's still spaces left at Gold Coast and Melbourne. That's Australia, May 25th through June 2nd. I'm going to be in Rhinebeck, New York at the Omega Institute, June 16th through the 21st. I'm going to be in Tokyo, Japan. I have just like one workshop where there's spaces. That's July 23rd. And I'm going to be in Helena, Montana at the Feathered Pipe Ranch, August 17th through the 24th. You can find out about those gigs and more and all of my stuff at jbrownyoga.com. All right. I think that's it. I'm not going to say any more. I hope this was good enough, Jim. I hope I did a good job with this intro. It's just going to be what it is. And really doesn't matter because this conversation is going to speak for itself. So let's get to it. I will touch base with you on the other side. But for now, let's listen to this talk that I had with Jim Mallinson.
Hello.
Hello, Jim.
Hi, Jay.
How are you, sir?
Yeah, good. Yeah, sorry about that. I nipped out for a quick cup of tea, and it took longer than thought. Can you hear me okay? Is this microphone? Because I haven't got headphones, I'm afraid, but I'm in a very quiet office, and I'm hoping that my brand new Mac will be up to the job.
Well, it sounds pretty good to me. I think we're good.
Good.
Very cool. Well, how are you? I'm glad you got a cup of tea. I got one too. We can both take a sip.
Excellent. I just had a good session with my colleague Jason reading one of our texts that we're editing, and I needed a quick perk up, I thought.
Nice.
Yeah, I'm good. How about you?
I'm doing okay. Same. Just my day's just getting started. I think yours is farther along than mine.
Yeah, mid-afternoon.
Yeah.
I'm acutely aware as well that you will have been entertaining your listeners heartily with one of your pre-podcast intros. I wonder what you.
Oh no! Well, I have to say it was such a joy to get your email and to think of you like traveling along some road in India, listening to the show with Seth that we did. That was super fun to get that email.
Yeah, well, you had a script, and it was great because it was a long drive. It was sort of 10 hours from Delhi to the festival, and it was a long one, wasn't it? That was longer than your average podcast. So that passed away 2 or 3 hours on the not particularly picturesque highways of Uttar Pradesh as we trundled along.
Well, I love that, and again, that was a particularly long episode, just because time got away from me, which normally it doesn't do, because I was just kind of engrossed. It's a topic that I'm always interested to talk about, but I am sometimes intimidated, which is the other thing I want to say, just sort of publicly. I know I said it to you in email. I made reference to you and that I was intimidated, but I want to be very clear that didn't have anything to do with anything you guys were doing. It wasn't that I felt like you guys were unapproachable. It's just my own projections on it. My own insecurities. Only the insecurities are really, I think, around just that I've never necessarily been very academically minded. Like analytical, but not academic necessarily. I've just never been like a cataloger of information or one who, I don't know, especially when it came to yoga, because my entrance into it was so much tied into like my experience in overcoming a spiritual wound. But I guess I'm curious, getting a chance to talk to you, when were you always academically minded from like an early age?
Yes. Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I was, I found academic work at school easy, and I was good at it from early on. Yeah. I got sort of moved up 2 years at school when I was pretty young. So that's that. And then I got a scholarship to Eton, which I expect most people have heard of. I mean, it's one of the most famous schools, the most famous school probably in England. And, everyone has to wear very bizarre uniforms. But the reason I'm talking about that is the fact that all the scholars then get grouped into this house together. And it's like a weird social experiment because it's, the hardest school in the country to get into. And then of the people who apply, 250 get in each year. And then about a dozen of those are scholars. And those dozen get packed in a house with, there's 5 years. So there's 60 of us in one house, including one of whom was Boris Johnson, who you may be aware of. But yes, it's a pretty, that was quite an intense intellectual atmosphere to be schooled in.
See, well, back then, what were you studying, or what was the focus, or what kind of scholarship were you doing?
Well, the scholarship itself I took when I was 11 or 12, and that's kind of general, and you stay pretty general for a while. But by the end of it, when I left at 17, because I went a year early, most people leave at 18, then I was reading Latin, double maths, and physics. But having said that, I wasn't a particularly keen student. And I got to that point, and I was kind of like, I didn't like any of my teachers, and I was kind of sick of those subjects, apart from Latin. But I couldn't carry on with it because I hadn't done Greek, and so universities wouldn't take you. You couldn't do classics without having done Greek.
So you had one more hoop to jump through, and you're like, "Fuck that! I don't want to jump through another hoop."
Well, I kind of, I was on the conveyor belt of going on to university, and also I was very keen to have a gap year. There's a sort of a tradition in England, really, where, well, I think it's dying out to some extent, but between, I guess, what you would call high school and school, I get confused by the American terminology, but when you leave high school at 18, before you go to university, a lot of people take a year out, which is obviously a great time of your life. You've got no real obligations. And I worked for a few months in London and then filled out my pocket with traveller's checks and headed off to India for 7 months, having decided that I was going to do Sanskrit. So I went through the prospectus for Oxford and basically said no to just about everything. Well, I did. And then I got to Oriental Studies and I thought, that sounds interesting. And I went off to Oxford for an open day. and Oriental studies in those days was basically Chinese. That was much the bigger subject, which it still is, Chinese and Arabic. And the Chinese professor was giving a talk, kind of intro talk for all the prospective students, and he was extremely boring and uninspiring. And I got to the end of that talk, and I thought, my God, I can't do this. This is terrible. So now I've been put off by another teacher. And he said, if anyone's interested in Sanskrit, the Sanskrit professor is in his study at the end of the corridor. And I thought, well, I've got nothing to lose here. And then the guy who was in the office, ended up being my tutor and then my PhD supervisor, and I'm still, very close to him and very much in touch with him. That's Alexis Sanderson.
Oh, I was reading about him. So that's the office you stumbled. That was the Sanskrit guy.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, well, he was that was the right guy to stumble on, apparently, from what I understand.
Exactly. So yeah, off I went. But having said that, I then did a degree in Sanskrit at Oxford, but really I was a pretty terrible student. I did the bare minimum to get by. I was just enjoying myself, having a good time as a young student. It didn't really turn me on at that point. I went to India at 17, and I was going to India as much, in my summer holidays.
And where did that come from? Why did you feel like you wanted to go to India in your gap year? Was that just like a common thing to do, or what was it about for you?
Tell you, I know because a friend of mine who was 2 years older than me at school, he'd done it, and he'd come back. He'd been in India for 6 months, and he kind of regaled me with great stories of just wandering around and the amazing times he'd had. And then I got completely hooked. Funny enough, at the end of that first trip, so I was there for 7 months, and at the very end of it, I was in Kashmir, and at the pilgrimage to Amarnath, which is this big ice lingam at 4,000 meters up in a cave in the Himalayas. That was just that was going to happen in a week or two. So lots of sadhus were camping there, lots of holy men. And I didn't actually have time to do the pilgrimage. My visa was running out, so I had to split and go back to Delhi and fly home. But I spent like a week hanging out in the camp of this set of holy men, and that was that, basically.
And what was it about that week what happened during that week that hooked you, do you think?
I think it's just, there's the combination. My interest, if that's the right, but probably not quite strong enough a word, but it's been fueled in two ways. By living on the ground in India, spending lots of time with these holy men, and the academic study, and the two kind of always fed one another. I don't think I'd have been able to do one on its own. But what gets me about the holy men, I think, was that, I was brought up, I was a teenager in the 80s, so I was presented with these kind of different paradigms of what's cool. There's the punks and the hippies in England. So you had this kind of, there's a punk attitude, which I think actually also in the English public school system is replicated of, really, you shouldn't give a shit. Shouldn't be seen to care too much about things. Yet be good at stuff. Yet get things done. If that makes sense, does that make sense?
It does. I've just been recently listening to this podcast series about the Clash, and I know how I grew up in the '80s too, and I know how that music was super important to me. It was definitely formative. I know what you mean. At that time, growing up in that time, there was a certain, there was Reagan and all this shit going on, and then you had your stuff in your country too. But there was a particular time, and it was a very pre-mainstream time for yoga.
Absolutely, yeah, and and these guys, yoga, to be honest, has always been just a part of it. It's never been the main thing for me at all. It's just a part of their way of life. But these guys are kind of, on the one hand, projecting complete rejection of normal values of society, but at the same time they're being kind of valorized, by society. And of course, it ultimately, I think, like what I was saying with my teachers at school, it boils down to individual charisma, and you get to hang out with the right charismatic person, and you're going to get drawn in. So there's a lot of that going on.
Well, that is interesting. I went to India in 1998. When were you there? When did you first go there?
My first trip was 88.
88. Yeah. Okay, so much earlier on. And I know when I went in 98, I was in a disillusioned place as a yoga teacher in America with no real connection to philosophy, frankly. Just mostly asana. Although I had learned a lot of stuff. I'd learned chanting, and I'd learned a lot of stuff, but there was just big gaps and big missing pieces to my understanding of things. And it's just, at some point, frankly, some of the things I had been taught about that I believe came from ascetic teachings about transcendent consciousness and renunciation, those things ended up having a detrimental effect on me. And then when I went to India, what happened for me is, one, I felt like I came to understand yoga in a new way, but not because I was in like a lot of classes, but just because I was there and I saw a lot of contradictions, just like going to temples or even meeting different teachers. I did meet one teacher who really did kind of turn things around for me. But I went hoping I was going to find a guru, and I didn't. I ended up finding a teacher who I think was coming from a much more tantric viewpoint and was basically telling me I should figure out how I feel and make my own determinations.
Huh. So you went looking for the guru, but in the end felt that ultimately you didn't need to find one.
No, what I got from that trip was that I didn't need a guru, or that there was a guru, but it wasn't an external guru. It was more of like an internal guru or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think I concur with that, and I think it's I think in the West, and we have, or in sort of Western yoga practice traditions and so forth, there's a different idea of the guru as well from how it really functions in India. Because I did this like in '92, I think. So I had 3 trips to India probably before '92, and I spent a lot of time hanging out with different groups of sadhus, wandering around. And then I realized that if I really wanted to get deep into all of this, then I needed to find a guru. That wasn't coming from a, like my soul needs saving and I need teachings from a guru to do that. I'd realized from observing the living traditions there that in order to get deep into one of these lineages, you need to be initiated. And that's the function of the guru. It's almost more of a way into a tradition. In terms of teaching, and I've been thinking about this recently, and I think, in an email you kind of touched upon it, and obviously it's a big issue in Western yoga traditions at the moment. But you don't have to have this kind of blind devotion, as I say, maybe a bit strong, but you don't have to like completely hang on to every word that your guru says and do exactly what he says, and it's or she, and that their teachings are the be all and end all. And in fact, it's been said to me many times, just within the tradition that I'm part of, that the samaj, so the society, the sadhus all together, that's the real guru. You can learn from everyone all around. It's not like you've got to devote everything to your one particular person.
Well, I think that's interesting. I know that a lot of the work that you've been involved with sometimes seems to be associated with this kind of, idea of like this changing paradigm, because some of the origin stories that we were taught or some of the things that gurus said seem to be called into question by some of the things that were being discovered. And yet you are someone who has a guru, which is, I think, not something that everybody would necessarily know. And you were just saying that the idea of the function of a guru, to me, what I'm curious about is that this guru, I heard you talking about in an interview, he's sort of known for doing like some of those crazy practices, like that one where you like roll your tongue back to your like soft palate.
Yeah, actually, no, he doesn't do that one.
Oh,
my uncle who does that. He does Vajroli Mudra. It's even more esoteric, sucking things up through various different orifices.
Oh, yes. That's what I'm getting them confused. Yeah. But see, those techniques to me, aren't those associated with ascetic traditions?
Yes. Well, actually, the sucking things up through your penis one, I've spent far too long researching and embarrassed myself giving lectures in front of. Just last week I was in Chicago, in fact, and I get to the very sort of very staid and stuffy annual meeting of the American Oriental Society.
See, but to me, that's you just keeping a little bit of your punk rock roots there. Just, you know what I mean? Just that little bit of, in that environment, that's the subject is kind of, there's a sweet thing there I could see.
Yeah, you're probably right. And I think some of the older hands enjoy being titillated a little bit in these gatherings as well. He's renowned as a Yogi Raj, and that's one of the things in particular that he's renowned for. Yeah.
Well, so how did you choose that guru? How did you decide that was your guru?
It was through charisma again. I'd gone to the Kumbh Mela in Ujjain in 1992, and it was those days. It was tough traveling. It was 2 or 3 days of jam-packed trains and buses. And on the last stage, met this one sadhu who's extremely ascetic looking. Super skinny with a huge crown of dreadlocks and wearing next to nothing but an iron loincloth. Anyway, I asked him where he was, what his name was and where he was staying. And he said he was staying, his camp would be in the Mangal Naat bit of the festival, and his name was Lakshman Das. And so Julie went and found the Mangal Naat area, and then, first camp I got to said, do you know someone called Lakshman Das? And they all kind of laughed because it's a very, very common name. It's a bit like asking, for John Smith or whatever.
Right.
And so pretty quickly gave up on trying to find that Lakshman Das. But we didn't, because it then turned out by coincidence that there was another Lakshman Das who had a Canadian disciple, and he had a camp there. And so we kind of fell in, he was very, very welcoming, very nice. So then we started staying with this other Lakshman Das at his camp in the festival. And so you have these kind of small individual camps with one guru, but they're, part of a larger camp, which is then part of a larger camp and so forth. So in the wider camp where we were staying, my future guru also had his camp, and we were sitting by the fire of Lakshman Das one day, and I was with my girlfriend, now wife Claudia, and this sadhu nudged her and pointed at this Baba walking through the camp and said, "Watch out for him. If he gets inside you, he'll suck out all your shakti, all your energy." Okay, so that kind of instantly piqued my interest, because it was clear that he was referring to this Vajroli Mudra technique that I'd read about already in some yogic texts. And so then we kind of, he was more intimidating as well. So the guy we were staying with already was very nice and friendly, but he's kind of too easy. He was kind of too keen to have foreign disciples, that kind of thing. It was kind of part of his thing. Whereas we sort of edged close to this other Baba and started hanging out in his tent a bit, but he didn't speak any English, made no attempt to speak any English really. So we were never quite sure what was going on. And he had this wild scene where, not only was he this charismatic, very, very handsome, good-looking young yogi who'd recently been kind of elevated to the position of Mahant. He had this wild chela disciple who was only about 11, who also looked equally wild. Then he had this kind of non-sadhu disciple, like a lay disciple from the nearby town called Captain Sahib, who had this ambassador car with flames painted down the side and big orange flag. And so we were hanging out in this tent for a while, but still going back to, for a few days, but we'd still go back to Lakshman Das's and camp under the tree. And then one day we were with Babaji, who became our Guruji, and he kind of half explained what was going on, but my Hindi wasn't that good in those days. And next thing we know, we're in a car, in Captain Sahib's car, being taken across the Madhya Pradesh hinterland for about 3 hours in the middle of the night, and we arrived at this place called Omkareshwar. It must have been 2 a.m. And we were taken down to the river there, we bathed, and then we were initiated. We were given the mantra and given a necklace with the tulsi bead around it, and also the tilak, the forehead marking, was put on our forehead. Foreheads, because it's clear as well. And then we drove back through the night, got back to the festival, and went back to our normal place under the tree where we'd been staying. And of course, we didn't wake up till quite late, like 9 o'clock, which is really, most people are getting up at 5 or 6 or whatever at the latest. And so Lakshman Das came over to sort of wake us up. Hey, what's going on? And then he saw on our foreheads that we had this, we hadn't washed them off, the forehead markings, and he knew what had happened. And he was pretty cross. And we kind of sheepishly gathered up our belongings and moved into Babaji's tent. He'd basically become our guru. And that was that. Then spent most of the next 10 years wandering around India with him.
Now, was that other guru upset because he wanted you to be initiated as his disciples?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, he recognized, that we were, certainly the fact that I had a Sanskrit degree was pretty unusual for the Westerners wandering around the Kumbh Mela. Most of them don't have much idea what's going on. So I think he was keen to,
Now,
to bond in a way. And I suppose, he'd been very nice and friendly, but as I said, I was looking for something more challenging, I think.
And did you have a clear sense of what you were being initiated into? Did you have to take any kind of vows or anything like that?
Sort of, yeah. Vegetarian, no booze, or at least not when wearing the necklace is, in theory, what the vows are.
Oh, only when you're wearing the necklace, you're not supposed to do it. Is that the deal?
Yeah, that's what I was told. Yeah, yeah, that was it really. Because it's only people misunderstand, and particularly because of the way I have long dreadlocks and so forth. I never had a full sadhu initiation. Mm-hmm. I'm just a lay devotee. There are kind of 2 grades of initiation. So that means
that goes to my question, because I'm curious about that. Because if it's an ascetic tradition, I know that you're like a householder. So you said there's 2 grades of initiation. One's for people who aren't renouncing.
Yeah. Which is much, much less of a big deal. It's a much more big deal if you're going to become a full-on renouncer. But I was tempted over the years, especially when I had a row with Claudia after the forest.
I completely understand that. At one point in my life, I think it would have been easier, but I think it wouldn't have been healthy. But I understand the impulse, and I don't know where that impulse comes from. I don't have a lot of way to explain why I have that impulse or like a passion for these things. It seems to come like for you too, that you would immerse yourself in that way. I know people who studied Sanskrit who didn't do that.
Sure, no, it's pretty unusual. That's definitely amongst my colleagues. It's not that. I mean, there's many people who spend a lot of time in India, but normally, if the sort of Sanskrit scholars who do that, it'll be with, in Brahmin communities, whatever, reading texts and so forth. But I think everyone has it in them to some extent, don't they? The kind of constant dilemma between engagement and withdrawal from society. There's different balances in different people.
Well, but I guess my question, and this is sort of something that I was talking with Seth about, which is I've always felt like there's something at odds with like ascetic teachings of yoga and other not ascetic teachings of yoga that are more about integration. That, like, how do you translate an idea of transcendent consciousness in a way that's constructive for someone who's living in the world?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think that, that's actually over the last few years kind of realized more and more that's sort of the big question in my work, is how it's pretty clear that yoga originated amongst these extreme renouncers of society. And then at some point, really only over the last 1,000 years, I think, it's become, something that, as you say, can be integrated into living in the world, and it becomes a sort of body positive thing. Like these extreme practices of tapas have always been closely linked with yoga as well. And there's a guy, there's a sadhu, in fact, I'm going to be seeing next month, I think, in India, called Amar Bharati, who's held his arm up in the air for 40 years or something. And we interviewed him in the documentary I made at the Kumbh Mela in 2013, I think. I think this made it into the cut, but he's repeated it since, actually. He quite often says it. And so he's held his arm up in the air for 40 years, and he says that is the ancient yoga. In Hindi, prachin yoga hai. And so that couldn't be further removed from notions of cultivating the body and making yourself, feel good and reducing stress, whatever, through yoga. So at some point, over the last, I think it's round about 1,000 years ago, if we start looking at the textual and the kind of sculptural evidence, there's a shift happens. And I don't know why. I have no great theories. One person I know of does argue that there's a kind of global shift then towards somatic practices in religions, all over. Why that should have happened, I don't know, but something seems to have happened. I used to argue for absolute continuity, and I think a lot of there is continuity as well, but then these new practices and new positive kind of body positive, and as you mentioned, concomitant with integrating into society, this new approach to yoga appeared.
Well, one of the things I talked with Seth about, and one of the things that was my initial entrance, like the first sort of scholar practitioner who resonated with me, was Georg Forstein. And, he hypothesized or wrote about, earlier yoga back to Vedic times and pre-Vedic age and back to Stone Age shamanism, and was sort of saying that this was different than Patanjali's 8-limbed path, of dualistic path. And I'm curious what you think about that. I know we're trying to reach back to a dim past that doesn't have texts always. So maybe that's why it never starts there. But he certainly wrote about that. And I'm curious if you have anything to say about it.
So you slightly dropped out there. So the distinction between what the kind of ascetic tradition of Patanjali and the Ashtanga system that he teaches, and then what more shamanic.
Well, like when we talk about the origins of yoga, and you just sort of talked about like 1,000 years ago and ascetics, and I read Georg writing about pre-Vedic times, where there was about the weal of the community rather than the salvation of the individual, that pre-Patanjali and pre these texts, there was still yoga happening in oral traditions, and that was very different than what we ended up getting in the texts. Okay,
and no, I don't want to, disagree too strongly with you.
No, please. I want you to disagree completely if you do.
Well, then it's total conjecture, isn't it? I mean, there's no way you can say what was going on then, because we have no evidence of any sort whatsoever. I mean, the only evidence we've got prior to about 4th or 5th century BC, Upanishads and perhaps some of our Buddhist sources go back there and talk about practices which are clearly the same as things that then get codified as yoga. Prior to that, we get a little, some curious stuff about breath, maybe in the Vedic text from 1000 BC. Okay, so we just got these texts. We've got no material sources at all, no like sculptures or anything like that. Apart from, of course, the Indus Valley civilization, where we have this Pashupati seal, it's called. So you must know about this. Mm-hmm. I mean, you pick up just about any book on
Georg specifically mentions that seal as like the earliest evidence or whatever.
That's the only thing, and that's just a guy sitting cross-legged. Okay, maybe it's quite a difficult cross-legged position, but then to postulate from that means everyone was doing, or people were doing yoga, just seems too strong a leap to me.
Okay, I think I get that. I guess my other question. Go ahead. What are you going to say?
Well, I'd say people might have been doing yoga, sure. We just don't know, And to say that they were, and definitively, is going beyond our evidence.
Well, I think saying anything about the origins of yoga definitively is problematic. It seems.
Yeah, sure. Until we get material and textual sources that we can date.
Right.
And you picked up on me talking about 1,000 years ago. So what I'm saying about 1,000 years ago, and I'm being quite specific. Like maybe we can even refine it to 900 years ago. We see a change in how yoga is codified in text, not just in text, but also how it's represented in material sources. So in fact, one of the big discoveries of the project I'm working on at the moment was this gate, this archway in Gujarat, which after a lot of rootling around, I think I can date pretty confidently to 1230. And we went to look at it. It's in this real dive of the town. Really, it would have been beautiful one day, but it's been badly looked after. There's this amazing decorated archway, and it's got these. I was going there because I'd read in some obscure Hindi article that it had carvings of these 9 Nats, these sort of famous yogis from about 1,000 years ago. And sure enough, those carvings were fantastic, and there were other beautiful things of beautiful sculptures of yoginis and forms of Shiva. These were quite big, but then we looked up into the archway above, and we saw a whole load of small carvings of yogis and yoga postures, like complex yoga postures, headstands, this kind of thing, weird balances. And so until, like I said, 900, maybe 1,000 years ago, yoga postures that we know from text and from our material sources, sculptures and so forth, it's all like static seated positions, or austerities where you might, hold your arms up in the air for 12 years or stand up for ages. And then suddenly we get the arrival of balancing postures, headstands, which you can't hold indefinitely, this kind of thing. And that coincides also within the text. That coincides with the first texts that actually teach the mechanics of physical yoga practice, and also coincides with yoga being associated with more positive, society integrated ends as well. So there, I think we can, that's what I'm saying, with our sources, textual and material, we can confidently say that something happened then. But to go anywhere, and then 1,000 years prior to that, we can be fairly confident. Again, we've got material sources representing yogis and ascetics going back to Sanchi, for example. The stupa at Sanchi is perhaps the earliest. And we have texts going back to a little bit before that, 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries BC. But before that, it's all conjecture.
Right. Well, I guess the only other question I have there, it certainly seems like those carvings and the period of time that you're referring to, that is certainly the origins of yoga when we're talking about like what we see now where it's all about poses. Yeah. I guess what I'm curious about is more what we were talking about before in terms of more like ideas, that I'm wondering, like, for me, when I did try to look at Vedas, which is very difficult to do when you're not a Sanskrit scholar.
Even when you are.
It seems like a kind of impossible task, and it's a thing. But when I tried, what I thought that I saw there, and I can't back it up a lot, but what I felt was like at the beginning there in the early like Rig Veda, there weren't priests, but at the end there in the Atharva Veda, there were priests. Like it did seem like it starts in one kind of place and ends in another, that there's some kind of evolution and shift that happens within there. Is that too much conjecture to say is even? No, but I don't think that's got much, if anything, to do with yoga, though. I don't think priests and yogis, I mean, there has been some overlap, but generally one sees, if anything, a tension between the priestly Brahmanical traditions and the ascetic yogi traditions in India. Of course, there are overlaps as well, but I mean, if one looking at it a purely kind of, materialist historical perspective, they're competing over resources. So the yogis were not in bed with the priests; they were the outcasts or whatever, the outskirts.
That's at the start. So I mean, I'm not. I really wouldn't say I'm an expert on the early stuff. I mean, I've read enough of it, but there's a guy, Johannes Bronkhorst, is the kind of foremost scholar of that, of the early period of ascetic practice in India. These Shramana traditions, who are usually contrasted with the Brahmanical traditions, and they appear in the sort of 4th, 5th century BC, and amongst those traditions are the Buddhists, Jains, and then lots of other kind of weirder, obviously little sects that we don't really know much about, these Arjivakas, that kind of thing. And you get references to them predominantly in Buddhist texts, but also we have some Jain sources. And they are, they are opposed to Brahmanical Vedic sacrificial tradition. So the key to the Vedic sacrifice in that early period is sacrifice as we understand it, of killing animals. So they reject that. That is where ahimsa comes from within the Buddhist tradition. And so they introduce these ascetics who've renounced society, and they, in this period, and Bronkhorst argues very convincingly, I think, that this all happened in this area called Greater Magadha in the north of India, near the border with Nepal. And during this period is when these ideas of karma and rebirth, and so your karma affects your rebirth, you're constantly being reborn, and that's basically not a pleasant experience. Life is mainly suffering, and so you want to get off this constant cycle. And yoga is one of the answers to how can we get off this cycle, normally kind of in tandem with ascetic practice as well. What's generally called tapas within the text. So these concepts that are key, that are central to understanding the kind of philosophy behind yoga, subsequently, they all develop within these ascetic traditions in that early period. But then the genius of Hinduism, even though obviously the term Hinduism didn't exist then, but the genius of Hinduism is that these things appear on the peripheries and maybe appear as challenges to its worldview and the way it functions, and then it's able to absorb them. Okay, so now yoga, karma, reincarnation, ahimsa, non-violence are all seen as kind of key central tenets of Hinduism, but they actually initiated they actually started externally to its kind of mainstream Vedic tradition.
I guess what I'm looking for, and I think it's there has always been this bit of tension, like you said. I mean, I guess my question is there a thread of yoga not being us trying to get off of this cycle, but getting into this cycle in a more harmonious way? Like, hasn't that always been a thread in yoga as well?
Yes, I suppose. Well, I don't know about always. I think it did originate, from what we can tell. As I say, it's pretty sketchy until the Mahabharata. But even Mahabharata, you get very massively understudied passages in the 12th book of the Mahabharata, which is predates Patanjali by a few centuries probably, and has quite detailed yoga teachings. But they're very much seen as a method of achieving liberation. They're not for kind of worldly advantage. And I think it's, as you mentioned earlier, you touched upon tantric traditions that we start getting codified in text again from about the 5th, 6th century AD. And in those, there's often a distinction is made between the bubukshu and the mumukshu. So the bubukshu is someone who wants bhoga, which means kind of enjoying worldly pleasures, and the mumukshu is one who wants moksha, which means liberation. And so you can choose either path as part of your work. But even then, people who do yoga generally aiming more for moksha, but you can go the other way. And so more tantric traditions of yoga. So, for example, in the text that I worked on for my PhD called the Khetri Vidya, if you get the practice right, you get all these amazing siddhis, these great powers and worldly benefits. But I don't think really. I mean, you get siddhis being mentioned, of course, in Patanjali, but they're kind of distractions along the way, possibly. Although one can read it the other way, the third book. One can read it as though people are aiming for these things. So, yeah, maybe you can tell I'm thinking as I
appreciate that, because that's what I was going to say, and I talked with Seth about that too, is it also seems that when...
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.